Saturday morning, and we are going to get started. So if you could click the next slide for me, Becca. We're going to go through our traditional openings. My slide is not moving, Becca, so I'm still on the main slide.
Oh, okay. Well, I can roll through these. Shasta's not with us today, so you'll have to listen to me bumble through it. Shasta's usually so eloquent. So our reminders, be mindful of your mic. If you're able to, please keep your video on. Remember, this is a recorded session and take breaks as needed. Here is a picture of how to navigate Teams. Reach out if you have any questions.
Hey, Becca, it's not moving on my slide. It might be moving on screen for everybody else, but I'm still on the very first slide.
It's moving for me, Becca.
Okay, cool.
Good.
Cool.
Yeah. Our team norms, remember to participate respectfully, welcome multiple viewpoints, devote your attention to those speaking and sharing. Feel free to ask questions for clarification, be courageous and speak your truth, own your intentions as well as your impacts, and honor our time together. Quick reminder, stay connected through the Kentucky Leads SharePoint site. The directory is up to date. And if anyone has a new email address, I feel like there are a couple people that might have one. Make sure that you email that to me and I can invite you to view the site with your new email address. And also please visit the Kentucky Leads discussion board to keep the conversation going. I know that Shasta did start a discussion board thread about post-secondary transition to get us started. So there's already one there for today's content. In case you missed it, the last session was physical restraint and seclusion. Jared shared with us, Jared Sloan. If you missed that session, please view the recording and fill out the sheet and get that to me or Mike. And here's a link to the session, but you can find it in the Kentucky Leads SharePoint site. Our agenda today, we're going to have scholar check-in. Then Mike is going to have some Kentucky Leads Academy updates. Allison Johnson is with us with Office of Special Education and Early Learning, and she's going to share around post-secondary transition. We'll have a quick break, and she'll come back and share more. The plan is to give you guys plenty of time in small group discussions, or attempt to. It's always a tight schedule. And then we'll come together at 11:50 for group sharing, and then we'll have evaluation and wrap up.
Thanks, Becca.
Mike? Yeah.
Good to go. Just want to remind everyone to please complete the end of day evaluation. That's really important. We actually are preparing our what they call APR, Annual Performance Report, which goes into Washington. That'll be submitted next month, and we use those results. So we were looking at those recently, so please keep those coming in. And then it also allows us to make adjustments to our content and practices here on the Saturday sessions. Discussion board is also important. Please get up on the discussion board, post questions. We're taking a look at those, trying to see if there's some things that we can adjust there to get folks a little more engaged with that. There are going to be some other announcements Becca's going to follow up with here, but want to also lastly to encourage you, as far as your classes that you're taking with your at your universities, need to be thinking about summer if you haven't already registered for those, or thinking about what that's going to be looking like for you, or in the fall. So things are moving quickly. Cohort 2 starting to wind down our time here on the Saturday seminars. It's hard to believe. So just keep some of those important dates and topics in mind. Thanks. I'll turn it over to you, Becca. You're on mute, Becca. I can cover this one if you need.
So we're down to 2. We usually have Bill and Shasta with us, and it's just down to me and Mike today. So our apologies. So scholar responsibilities and attendance. You already reviewed this, Mike?
Yeah, let me just keep rolling. So
Okay.
these are things that we really need you to focus on. And the one I'll hit on is, for some reason, if you do miss a session, we do need you to review the recording, and then there's a questionnaire we need you to complete for that recording and send in to Shasta and myself. And then we also want you to reach out to your colleagues here. These are important times, not just getting through the content, but also building relationships. Because as you move on, once you finish up your work here with the LEADS project and move into various professional roles as directors of special ed and other administrative roles, the folks that you're meeting here are going to be vitally important. And so we want you to build those relationships. That's part of the reason behind the summit that we have, to bring everybody together face to face, but also share what you're learning here too with other colleagues. So with that, I'll send that back to you, Miss Becca.
Part of the grant requirement is for each scholar to be evaluated through the skills and competencies checklist. This year, we evaluated cohort 2, and I'll send you that invitation today or tomorrow. I'm going to try and send them out today. But the categories for the evaluation include the attendance, the academy participation, as well as your capstone presentation and your IHE program completion. We also evaluate scholars regarding professionalism and your interaction with the SharePoint discussion board, which is the reflect and respond, the reminder that we always send you. So those are the 6 categories. Each scholar, the goal is at least 75%. And I can tell you now that everyone in cohort 2 made that cutoff point. So good job. Way to go. The Kentucky LEADS Summit, just another reminder, it's June 9th and 10th. It's an in-person in Louisville. More details are coming soon. I will say that I sent out an email yesterday regarding this and how to register, and I had several questions already. And we thought about having time for questions and answers today, but decided instead of using this time for that, if you'll email me questions, then we can kind of build like just an informal FAQ, and we can put the answers on Kentucky LEADS SharePoint site. So if you do have any questions, just email those to me, and I'll get them. I'll respond and then post the answers in SharePoint as well for everyone to see.
I just want to let everybody know too, that June 9th, it's a little deceptive. We're just having a little meet and greet on the evening of June 9th after everybody checks in. We just wanted to
before
now. If everybody could go ahead and mute, there we go. So we're just having a little meet and greet in the evening on the 9th. I didn't want everybody to think June 9th was a full day. It's just in the evening. We have one little meet and greet session. Thanks, Becca.
And I cannot believe it, but it's almost time for cohort 4. If you have anyone that would be interested in participating, please let them know. It's coming in April. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, if not, with that, I would like to introduce Allison Johnson. She works with the Office of Special Education and Early Learning, and she is our post-secondary transition consultant. Allison.
Good morning. So thank you. Yes, I'm Allison Johnson. I, as Rebecca said, work in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning. I've been there for about 3 years. Before that, I taught high school special education in Scott County, and before that, I taught middle and high school special education in Massachusetts. So all with older kids. But I'm going to go on ahead and take the screen from you, if that's all right. Okay. And maybe going to take the screen from you. Oh, Teams. Maybe.
There we go.
Hey,
Yeah,
there we go. Okay. Cool. All right, so as Becca said, we're going to be talking about post-secondary transition. That is not all that I do at KDE, but that is a lot of what I have done at KDE. Here's my contact information. That will be up at the end. Also, if you have additional questions, or you can let any of your leaders, Becca, Mike, they can all get a hold of me too. So for our time today, we're going to do an overview of post-secondary transition. We're going to talk about Kentucky's post-secondary transition data. We're going to talk about what we mean when we talk about transition services. We're going to talk about regulatory requirements under the Kentucky laws. We're going to talk about predictors of post-school success, and then some general transition practices, including some guidance that has been put out by the KDE. There will be a break in there when we get to it. So I promised Becca and Shasta and Bill and Mike that we would have some interaction, and we will. So to start with, when we're thinking about post-secondary transition, if you could, what is post-secondary transition? When I use that phrase, what does that mean? Either in the chat, raising your hand, or whatever mechanisms you all usually use to share in the big group. What is post-secondary transition? Transitioning to life after high school, to life learning and employment after high school, transitioning into the real world, transitioning to adulthood. New topic, experience is only little people. That's good. I have no experience with little people. So we'll go from there. Follow through on the ILP, life after high school, jobs, caring for self, generalizing what you've learned to life after high school, adult life ready, transition to college or career. Yeah, absolutely. So we're really looking at, when we think about post-secondary transition, it's really quite broad. We're really talking about the process, services, skills that we're engaging with students and helping them develop so that they can move from our very specific, like P12 world as a student into that adult world where we have education, employment, independent living. Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing. So we're going to break out in just a minute, but first we're going to talk through the slide and give model and example. So why does post-secondary transition matter? So in a few minutes, Becca's going to break you all into breakout rooms so you can have a chance to share. So everyone will have a chance to share. And you're talking about what was your first competitive employment position? And looking back, how did that position impact you? And let me first define, what do we mean by competitive employment? Does anyone know? You can pop it in the chat if you do. Pay equal to peers. That's absolutely a very important piece of competitive employment. Had to interview for the position. That's probably an important piece, but not necessarily a requirement, but typically that is true. Yeah, so competitive employment, the legal definition, there's actually a couple of different regulatory definitions, but what we mean here in the post-secondary transition world is that it's an employment position where you are employed, you're receiving both pay, but also opportunities for training and advancement that are similar to your non-disabled peers, and you're working with your non-disabled peers, right? So this is not a sheltered workshop. This is actually not typically working for like your family business where you're just like your family runs a restaurant. But this is some other sort of employment position where you got paid like everyone else and you had opportunities to advance just like everyone else. And there's some more pieces to that we'll talk about later, but that's the broad gist of it. So what you're going to do when you go into your breakout rooms is you're going to talk about what was your first competitive employment position and how did that position impact you? For me, my first employment position that met the requirements of competitive employment, I was a Girl Scout camp counselor for 3 years after high school and in college. And when I think back, that was like a really big deal. I learned a lot of independence. I was in a completely different state from where I grew up. I had to work with people from across the country, actually across the world, with people from all over the country. And coming from Kentucky, I'd never met anyone from New Zealand before or from Denmark before. And they had very different ways of looking and thinking about the world. I had to learn how to do things like figure out navigating, getting to a laundromat when I was a completely different state and I didn't have a car. So I had to learn how to collaborate, how to ask for help. Like these are all skills that folks worked on with me when I was a K through 12 student. But that first competitive employment position is when I really had to like make it happen with some real world consequences if I couldn't figure it out. And so I look back really fondly on that job. I loved it. It was a lot of fun, but I really learned a lot. And that's why that mattered, right? Having those skills to be able to go find that job and being able to hold that job for 3 years really helped me understand a lot about what I'm doing now. That's the first time that I worked extensively with kids. And here I am many years later, still working with kids in education. Yes, stinky camp clothes at a laundromat is an experience, 100%. So when you go into your breakout rooms, which Becca's going to do for us here in just a moment, that's what you're going to do. You're going to share what was your first competitive employment position and think back on what sort of impact that position had on you. Whenever you're ready, Becca.
And how long will they have in their?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. How many folks are here? How many folks are in a breakout room typically, Becca? I should have asked you that earlier.
Oh, so there's between 6 and 7. There's a few with 5. I mean,
Okay,
even
so
these out a
then
bit.
let's do 6 minutes,
6.
and you'll just have to be snappy.
Okay, let me.
Or if you have the time already loaded, Becca, that's fine too.
Okay, no, we'll do it for 6 minutes. That works.
Hey, we're up in Boston. In Boston, were you like suburbs or?
So I lived about half the time in Brighton, which is a neighborhood of Boston, and then I moved to Somerville and then Arlington, which are both suburbs directly, like they're still on the T lines.
Yeah, yeah.
Boston.
I had a lot of contract work up there years ago, so I spent a couple years, spent a lot of time up there, and I was mainly kind of around kind of the Harvard Yard area, but I want to say we went down south, suburb of the South, in the south of Boston, and I want to say it's like Wakefield or Braintree. Does that sound right? Yeah.
Yep.
And so anyway, just a lot of good memories up there. Boy, that winter's rough though.
Yeah.
Whoa, rough.
Yeah.
I'm closing the rooms now. It takes a minute for them to all filter back in.
Okay.
Because there's so many of them. Hey, Jen. It's good to see you.
Break. It's Saturday, so it allowed me to join. But it's good to see everybody too, especially Allison.
See, the rooms are still closing. Give everybody a minute to get reacclimated. You may want to check your mic. And then I've lost Allison. Can you all see her?
I can see you.
see her.
Okay, good. Good. Okay, Allison, I'll mute my mic and you can continue. Thank you.
All right, so I hope that you all had good conversation. I know that we did in this main room, and I would love for, if there are maybe, let's say, 2 folks who would like to share your position and the impact it had on you with the whole group. You can just unmute and talk or raise your hand or whatever mechanism you all usually use.
I don't mind sharing. Sorry. I began my first competitive position was in the community mental health system, not even in education, and I ended up working with children in the mental health system. And I was telling my group that I valued so much of my time in the mental health system because I have a unique perspective on what I do now. Once I got into the school system, I taught special ed, I taught regular ed, and now as administrator. And truly, those skills and the things that I learned when I first began my professional career, totally, I use those all the time.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. That's where I started also in Massachusetts when I taught Massachusetts at a residential treatment facility. It's some great work. One more person to share?
This is Kim. I just had a kind of an epiphany actually while we were in our breakout room. I was a lifeguard and I was talking about how those summers between 16 and 20, but that it just hit me that there was a special needs child family that would come to the pool, and I kind of befriended them and watched them. And it kind of hit me that like maybe that's where my love of working with special needs, kids came from, was watching that family, watching that kid come. It never made that connection before because I really have been in the world of early childhood. But this was an older child. But I just wonder if just watching him and watching that family, it kind of led me down this path that I didn't even realize it until we were talking about that and that impact on me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great realization. So I hope that the takeaway from this conversation for everyone has been that competitive employment is really impactful and meaningful, and it mattered a lot to us. And so it matters to our students. So let's take a look at what some of the data says about our employment for our students. So I know this is a little small. I'm going to be quiet for about a minute here in a minute. This is, just to give you the very brief context, the post-school outcome data for Indicator 14. Indicator 14 is part of the State Performance Plan annual performance report that we report to the federal government every year. And this data is about what our students are doing after high school. So I'm going to take just a minute to be quiet and let you all take a look. And I just want to know in a minute what sorts of things you've noticed, what questions you have. All right, so I very intentionally did not explain the data first. What questions do you have, or what do you notice? What's something that stands out to you about this data? Either in the chat or unmute and shout it out. I'm not super surprised that Part A has the fewest. Why not?
Just from, that was me, Katie, that typed that. And just from like working in the high schools, I've noticed, and I've worked in a couple different states, but hang on, baby. But I've noticed that, you know, students in the special education program, unfortunately, man, this hurts my heart to say it, but really, like, the special education program is helping them get through their classes and earn their credits to graduate. I am not super convinced that we do a good job as a nation, as far as special ed goes, like actually teaching these kids the grade level content when they have disabilities. Not significant, I'm talking LBD disabilities. So I just don't think that most of our students that receive special ed services are prepared to be successful in a post-secondary setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to clarify, for those who may not be familiar with indicator 4, Part A, which is that blue line at the bottom, is higher education. So this is the percent of students that graduated or left high school 1 year after high school. This is all part of the Kentucky Youth 1 Year Out data. So 1 year after they left high school, they were enrolled for at least one semester in a higher education program. So that's a 2-year or 4-year program. So that is that blue line Part A. And so, Katie, it sounds like what you're saying, and I hear what you're saying, is that we're doing our students with disabilities maybe a disservice, and we're not necessarily preparing them well to meet those standards to go on ahead and enroll in higher education. And I think that's fair. Another piece to note while we're looking at this data and thinking about this data does stop at the 2021 year. So that's leavers, so high school leavers in 2020, which of course was the first part of COVID. The next year's worth of data will be released relatively soon, I think. And I'll show you in a minute where to find all of this. But that's what we have right now. So these are leavers who left in May, typically, of COVID year, just as a side note. Other noticings or wonderings about the data? Thoughts, questions?
I think what's interesting is when you look at it as this, it's Amanda, by the way. When looking at this as a whole, I have a sibling with disabilities who is an adult that lives with me. And what this data shows, now he's significantly older, but the outcomes are not any different. So not only do they not have higher education, they also don't have employment. So you have this large group of students where we've gotten them through to meet that credit requirement for graduation, but within a year to 5 years, these are persons who are not self-sufficient and are not able to live independently. And that has other far-reaching components long-term.
Yeah, absolutely. And so speaking of employment, Part B, which is the orange line, that is calculated. It includes everyone in Part A, so everyone who is in some sort of higher education 2 or 4 year program, and all students who are competitively employed, an average of 20 hours a week for at least 90 days in that 1 year after high school. Other questions, noticings, wonderings?
I have a question. I had to look up. I'm not familiar a lot with the post-secondary group of students, and so I had to look up what A, B, and C was. And so I'm looking at a chart on KD's website for my county. We did not meet the target for Part A. What is the target?
So that's a really great question. So I'm going to back up for 1 second and explain Part C also, and then we'll talk about how to find the targets. So Part C includes all of Part A and all of Part B. So that's all of the students who were enrolled in higher education, a 2-year program, a 4-year program, all the students who are competitively employed for at least an average of 20 hours over 90 days in that year after high school. And then Part C also includes any students who are in other education which is typically some sort of training or vocational program. So think about like a welding certificate or like a cosmetology certificate program that are less than 2 years. They're enrolled at least one semester term, however it works for that program. And other employment. So that's any employment that doesn't meet the standards for competitive employment. So that could be, like we talked about earlier, working in a family business or on the family farm. It could be doing like DoorDash, because that's not technically employment. You're I've lost the word, not consultant, but it's a gig job. So all those gig jobs.
Labor.
Contract labor. Thank you. Yeah, all those gig jobs. Those are all other employment. So when you're talking about the targets for these are set on a 6-year cycle for the SVP APR. And it changes. And so that's always available through the KDE IDEA Part B website. There's like reports with all of that information of what the targets are. Or we can look at, this is actually my next slide. We'll come back to it in just a minute. I'm going to talk about the Kentucky Special Education Indicator Dashboard, where you can find some more information about what the targets are also. So the target, to answer your question, changes each year. Oh, thank you. Caroline just dropped the link in the chat to the page I was talking about. So the target changes each year, but what I can say is that for Part A, Kentucky is typically pretty low. However, it's usually about 20%. Nationally, we have also seen since COVID hit a decrease in all students enrolling in higher education. So that's not just special education students, and that's not just Kentucky students. All students across the nation have been enrolling in higher education at significantly lower rates than they were prior to COVID. So everyone is seeing a pretty big drop in that. Other questions, noticings, wonderings about this data in particular? I saw someone say that it all seems to be, I think it was Savannah, it all seems to be plateauing. And I would largely agree. We see some small fluctuation, right? We see some small changes, but by and large, there's not been major changes in the last 10 years in Kentucky's data for transition for post-secondary outcomes for kids. Absolutely. I'll give you about 30 more seconds if anyone else has any noticings, wonderings, questions.
Do we know, Allison, if like other states' data looks similar as far as the plateau goes? I mean, is there any data that shows from a state that made significant improvements that we can learn from?
Yeah. So Indicator 14, that's a great question. Indicator 14 data is reported by all states to the federal government. So it's all available somewhere. And some states do have much better rates, or we see more improvement. But the other thing about Indicator 14 data that we have to carefully consider is that it is the way the data is collected by each state is different. So although we all have to report the data, the collection systems are different. And so we're reporting different. So like in Kentucky, we literally ask everyone. It's a full data set, right? We have the KIPSO, which is the Kentucky Post-School Outcome Center, and they run with doses across the state, where someone is calling every student, every parent of a student that left high school in the last year to essentially go through interview questions with them and see what we can get. And so our response rate for that is decent. It's usually about 60%. And so it's not like amazing, but for that scale of survey data collection, it's not terrible. Some states have much better response rates, but some states also do samples. Some states like Texas has a rather abysmal response rate. Their response rate is usually like 13 to 15%. And so sometimes it's difficult to compare because we don't necessarily, even if the pieces that we're measuring are the same, we don't know if we're getting a good representative picture of the population state to state. We do have to report what's called representativeness data. So like we have to do, well, KIPSO has to do, Tony LoBianco does, he's great. Representativeness analysis. And so basically what we're doing is we're comparing the group of responses that we got to our population to see if our answers, since we only got about 60% of the people responding, are a fair representation of the state population. And ours typically are. We sometimes have a bit of a geographic imbalance. We tend to get more responses from like the central Kentucky region and maybe slightly fewer responses from some of the other regions than the population necessarily is, but it's not typically enough to consider it to be really not representative of our population. So I meandered a bit from your question. Yes, you can find other states' data. Each state has to publicize it, but where that is a whole other issue. But it is available to look at. Yes.
Allison, I threw
Yep.
a link in the chat that goes to the an OSEP webpage, and you can
Perfect.
access there each state's SPP APR, and so you can find indicator 4 within each state plan there.
Thank you, Carolyn. And just know that that's going to be data charts, not these pretty graphs. Just FYI.
Okay, I have one more question and then I'll stop asking.
Yep, no, you're fine.
So like I've called and done the yo-yo surveys for a few years,
Mhm.
and I know there is, from what I can remember, there's not a place where you identify like the type of disability. Like there's no differentiating between like the students with mild disabilities and, you know, severe impairments, right? Does KDE dissect that data? Do you have access to the Infinite Campus to know their disability category?
So that's a really great question. So that is not reported as part of indicator 14. However, I will show you in just a minute. We can pull up and I don't know if I sent this link to Becca, but I can pull it up and we can make sure y'all get it. The KIPSO, the Kentucky Post-School Outcome Center, they report that data, and you can definitely look at it there. So yes, that is collected, but it's not part of what is reported to the federal government. The federal government takes our entire population as a whole. Good question. So other post-secondary transition data that we do look at or consider. So that's the big one. Indicator 14 is our big one that we really think about post-school outcomes. But we also have indicators 1 and 2, so that's graduation rates and dropout rates for students with disabilities. And then we have indicator 13, which is our compliance indicator with those transition requirements under the regulations. We're going to get into that in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at the special education indicator dashboard. And I had mentioned that earlier as a place where you can get more specific information for your district or your region in the state. And then we can also take a quick look at the KIPSO page. Oh, thanks, Carolyn. So the special education indicator dashboard, I think I have to share and unshare. So one moment. All right, can you all see a map with some directions? Maybe.
Yes, we can see the dashboard.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you. I can't see what you all can see when I'm sharing. All right, so this is the special education indicator dashboard. So we have public reporting of IDEA Part B, which is one of the links that Carolyn shared earlier, and that's the reports with the grids and the charts. But KY, so the OCL along with KY Stats, which if you're not familiar with KY Stats, you should absolutely check them out. They have fantastic data and information. They put together collaboratively this Kentucky Special Education Indicator Dashboard. And so what this lets you do is you can look at all of the results indicators. So like if we're looking at 14A, B, 14C, and you can choose the school year. I could do 2021. And you can filter by co-op, or you can just leave it like this. And it will show you, and you can hover and get more information, exactly what that district did. Now, the one caveat, especially for the indicator 14, and this is where sometimes going to those reports is more helpful. on the dashboard, if there were less than 10 students who met the criteria, so there were less than 10 students who left high school in the year that this was for, then KY Stats doesn't report it. So that's all that gray. So going district by district, it's sometimes hard to get good information, but you can also go by CERTAC if my internet wants to switch. And so in CERTAC, so you can see now 14C for that 1920 school year, we can take a look and we can see how they did. So we see that NKCS 14C was up here 77.8 percent. So they had really high rates of post-secondary. And then as we might expect, some of our more rural areas had lower rates. We can also looking at it by race and ethnicity or by sex or by primary disability category. And so again, this is by your CERTAC region, but so we can see these rates of achievement or these outcomes based on primary disability category. And if there isn't any, again, that means there are less than 10 students in that cohort or in that group that graduated. And so then the other one that we'll talk about real fast, the KIPSO, and some of y'all may, oh, no, that's the wrong one. The KIPSO, if you are one of the people responsible for collecting the data, then you can see your district's data, but everyone can see the KIPSO data for public use. And so the KIPSO data for public use will give you the option, so like the Yo-Yo 2022, I can sort this. So right now, this is everyone. And it's not divided up in exactly the way the indicator 14 is calculated, because indicator 14 combines some of these categories, but it still can give you some really good data about across Kentucky. We see that there were 167 students who left school in 2021 who were both enrolled in a higher education program and competitively employed. And I can sort that by gender. I could do it by disability category. I could look at boys who are autistic. And we can see then that across Kentucky, there were 10 males who were autistic enrolled in higher education and competitively employed 1 year after high school. And so you can really dig into some really interesting data going through this. And then this is the data that is used to calculate indicator 4, which is the reported in that SPP APR information. I'm going to, oh, thank you, Carolyn. Yes, that is the link to the indicator dashboard. I think it was also included in what Becca shared out prior to today's meeting. So while I'm reloading the presentation, any other questions about, I know that was a real quick overview because I see that it's already 10:50. So any other questions about that data, those data sources, how to find any of that information? All right, so I'm a data nerd. I really like looking at all of the data. I think it can also be really helpful when you start digging into some of the data for your district, thinking as doses and digging into even your region, in figuring out how you can start to leverage either working partnerships or some of these resources that we're going to get into here in a little bit to help improve those outcomes for kids. And part of that, again, I would strongly encourage, if you're not familiar with KY Stats, go take a look at KY Stats. They are all about data. They do workforce data, they do labor data, they do education data. They also have some really good resources in helping students figure out maybe what workforce area they should go into if they want the best chances of finding employment after high school for their region. They break it down region by region. It's really cool. But let's move on to our discussion of transition services. So when we talk about transition services, as special educators, we have a very specific idea of what we mean by transition services, right? It's as it's listed out under the IDA. But in practice, we also have some other transition services that you may run into, will almost certainly run into in a district. And these can be really confusing for folks. So the three main types of transition services that you'll hear us talking about in the post-secondary transition world are pre-employment transition services, or PREETs, vocational rehabilitation, or VR or OVR transition services, and IDEA transition services. So that link, a side-by-side view transition services, should be in the links that Rebecca, good grief, Becca sent out. And we'll make sure that you get it if not, but that's a resource from the NTACT, which is the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative, the NTACT-C, which we're going to talk more about in a minute. And they actually have a grid where they lay out side by side, here is what this kind of service provides, and here's what this service provides, and they really compare them. I'm going to do a real brief overview of them, but if you want more information, that's a really great resource for you. So, pre-employment transition services, PREETs, these are introductory, they're exploratory, they're intended to be short-term services. They are provided by the OVR, so the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. They can be provided directly, or OVR contracts with a lot of different providers across the state to give them. So if you have a community work transition program, CWTP program in your district, which there's one in a lot of districts, they contract with OVR, and that's not all that CWTP does, but some of what they do is the pre-employment transition services. JAG, the Jobs for American Graduates, that's one of the contract providers. And again, that's not all that JAG does, but this is one of the things that JAG does, among many others. The surtax can provide PREETs. The KCTCS, Kentucky Career and Technical College System, can provide PREET services. So these PREET services out of OVR are only for students with a disability in a recognized educational program. And VR, it's technically only for students who are potentially eligible for VR services. And so OVR services have different requirements than under the IDEA. And so these are for students who might qualify for VR students. If you have an IEP, you might qualify. If you have a 504, you might qualify. If you have any sort of documented disability, even if you don't have an IEP or a 504, you might qualify and still be able to get PREET services. And so that's an important distinction, that it's for these potentially eligible students. And these services are in 5 categories. There's job exploration counseling. This includes work-based learning experiences, post-secondary counseling, workplace readiness training, and self-advocacy instruction. So this is, again, really, it's the introductory pieces from OVR. This is like, let's get my 8th, 9th, 10th graders and figure out maybe where we want to take them so that we can work on getting them prepared, and not necessarily long-term, let's actually get them there. Let's just really figure out a plan. And then we have the vocational rehabilitation transition services. And so these are for students and youth with disabilities who are determined eligible by OVR. So they have to apply to OVR and be determined eligible. These focus on moving the student from school to post-school life. They're based on individual needs, preferences, and interests. This includes employment and other post-school adult goals, and that may include daily or independent living skill goals. And again, this is OVR's eligibility requirements, not IDEA's eligibility requirements. So students can be eligible for OVR services without having an IEP, and not every student who has an IEP will be eligible for OVR transition services. The other piece that's different about Voc Rehab is that these are high school students, but they can also be youth post-high school. So depending upon the state, OVR transition services go up to, I think, age 24 or 26. So it's past the age of IDEA transition services. Yeah, so that's real basic overview of Voc Rehab. And then, of course, we have the IDEA transition services. And so this is the actual language of the IDEA. This is the focus of our special education transition services section. And we're going to talk more in depth about our Kentucky regulations in a minute, but they align with this. And so under the IDEA, transition services is a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability. It's a results-oriented process focused on improving academic and functional achievement to facilitate movement from school to post-school activities. That can include post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, supported employment, continuing adult education, adult services, all of those things, and it's based on the child's individual needs. I see a hand, Becca.
That's mine. I just wanted to give you a 3-minute warning before we take a quick break.
Yep, perfect. I was actually going to stop at the end of the slide and we'll do that next activity next. All right. So these transition services are based on the child's needs. These are for students who have an IEP. They've been determined eligible under the IDEA, and so they continue. They must begin by age 16, and we'll talk more about that in a minute after our break, and then they continue until the child either graduates or ages out or exits eligibility under the IDEA, so no later than age 21 in the state of Kentucky. I'll stop for just a minute if anyone has. We're going to talk more about Kentucky regulations when we come back for break, but if you have any questions or comments on the 3 different kinds of transition services, or if you just want to get to break, that's fine too.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. It is 11:05. Allison, feel free to continue.
I will continue. And y'all have had some great questions and conversations, so we might speed through a couple of pieces so that we have time for more conversation at the end. But we're going to have a conversation about the regulatory requirements for transition services in Kentucky. And so this goes back to what we report for indicator 13 in the SPP APR. So indicator 14 and all that data was our actual post-secondary outcomes. And this is the compliance pieces within what is required in the IEP and what you have to do with your students. So there's a lot of different regs that apply. Most transition-specific regulatory requirements are in section 7, 1320, sorry, 707 KR 1320 section 7 under transition services, but there are some in other places, sections 2, 3, and 5 of 320, which is all about ARC meetings and the contents of the IEP. And then there's also a couple in 707 KR 1300. We're going to look at all of these and really break them down. So first, we'll start with section 7, which is the one with most of the requirements. And so when we're thinking about section 7, in the child's 8th grade year, or when they've reached 14 years, that's when we have to start doing something for transition. Now, this is when regulation requires it. Many districts do, and you can start earlier than this, but this is when it has to happen, when it must be documented. In alignment with the ILP, then the IEP needs to include a statement of the transition service needs, including the child's course of study. And so this is when we really start thinking, and it makes sense, right? In 8th grade, we're going to start thinking through what the student is going to take as a high school student in order to get them where they need to be. So we're thinking through, well, do they need to take some specific, I don't know, agriculture electives? Do we need to make sure that they're taking all of those pre-college requirements, that they're getting through not just algebra 2 and geometry, but also maybe into some pre-calculus, or whatever it is for what they want to do? This is where the ARC starts thinking through what their course of study is going to look like, and we make sure it's documented in the IEP. And of course, this has to be updated annually, as with all pieces of the student's IEP. And then the next big age milestone is the child's 16th birthday. The child's 16th birthday The IEP must include a post-secondary goal. It has to be appropriate and measurable. It has to be based upon age-appropriate transition assessments. And it has to relate to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living skills. And so this is one OSEP, so the Federal Office of Special Education Programs, has issued some guidance, and they're very clear that it has to be about employment. So it's education and employment. So you have to have a goal that is related to employment. And then if appropriate, if the ARC determines is appropriate, you could also do a goal about independent living skills. And again, at age 16, you have to start seeing the transitions or including the transition services, again, including that course of study that will be needed to assist the child in reaching these goals. I see a question in the chat. We've had some discussions. We have some kids turning 14 before 8th grade. Does the course of study have to include middle school courses? So that's a great question. So let's back and look at the reg. So the reg states that in the 8th grade year, or when the child reaches the age of 14, when we come down here, it includes a statement of the transition service needs of the child under the applicable components of the IEP, and it focuses on the child's course of study. So what do y'all think? Does that mean that we need to include middle school courses in our course of study if we have a 7th grader who's 14? I see a yes. I see a couple of nodding heads. Yeah, I mean, so if we're looking at a statement of transition services focused on the child's course of study, how can we know whether or not the transition service needs statement is focused on the course of study if we don't have the current course of study? And so that may just be that the course of study for 8th grade is just your standard 8th grade course of study, but that's also in many districts. That's a time when you have students who might be taking different, for example, math courses is the one where I see it most often. And so going back to a conversation we had earlier, if I have a student who wants to be pre-college, right, wants to go to college, it might be important to consider what math courses, as an example, would be taken in that 8th grade year. So yeah, under the regulation, I would agree that we need to see the current course of study whenever they turn 14. All right, we did this one. All right, so then another section would be 707-1320, section 3.4. And this is if the purpose of the ARC is to discuss transition services, then the child needs to be invited to the ARC. If they don't attend the ARC, the LEA needs to take other steps to ensure that the child's preferences and interests are considered. So that's the first part of this one. And so if the ARC is going to be discussing transition, then the student needs to be invited. Now, if you're only having annual reviews of the IEP, right, if you're only having annual review ARCs, then that annual review, once that student is 14, should always be discussing transition services. And so you should always have the child invited. Now, sometimes they don't want to come, and that's okay. But if they don't come, then you have to document other steps to ensure that their interests and preferences are considered. And then the other piece of this is that a public agency that is responsible for providing or paying for transition services also must be invited with the consent of the parent. And if that representative can't attend, then the LEA shall take other steps to obtain participation. So if one of the transition services that is identified by the ARC is going to be provided by a different public agency, it's going to be provided by, say, OVR, then you need to get consent and invite OVR to the ARC where they're discussing that service. And then this is another one. 707 KR 1320, section 514, at least 1 year prior to the child reaching the age of majority, which in Kentucky is age 18. The IEP must include a statement that the child has been informed of their rights and then it will transfer the child. So basically this is at least 1 year prior. So at least by their 17th birthday, you have to document in the IEP that you've had a conversation, that all those parental rights will be moved to the child when they turn 18. A lot of districts do this whenever the annual review is that the student is 16, and that's perfectly fine because that's more than 1 year prior. So it just has to happen by the child's 17th birthday. And then this is 1707 KR 1300, section 421. For students who graduate or age out of the program, so when they're leaving, the LEA or the district must provide the child with a summary of the child's academic achievement, and functional performance. There is not a specific required form for this in Kentucky, but there are sample forms available on the KDE Transition Resources webpage, which is one of the links that Becca sent out. And I'm not going to send you all of these regulations and talk about compliance without some resources. So we do have some resources. So we have the IDEA compliance record review, and all of the compliance pieces that are looked at for those regulations are included in that record review. And then we also have, I talked about them earlier, the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative. It's a mouthful. The NTAC-C, they have an entire Indicator 13 toolkit. It includes FAQs, case studies, checklists, best practices, and transition planning module. If you're not familiar with the NTAC-C, they are phenomenal. They have tons of resources. It's all aligned with the IDEA. Yes, Amanda, the toolkit is amazing. You do have to sign now. They've changed their website, so you do have to get an account, but it's totally free, and it's just so that you can like log in and save things, and they can track it because they're federally funded. They often offer free webinars and best practices and lots of really, really good resources. The one caveat that I will throw out there is that these are aligned with the IDEA and not necessarily the Kentucky specific KAR regulations. So they are really good resources and you should absolutely use them, but you also want to double check and make sure that you're hitting all of the components required under the Kentucky regulations, because there are a couple of things that are like in addition. So you're not going to, if you follow the NTAC stuff, you're not going to not be in compliance for those pieces as long as you're doing those pieces. But there are some other pieces that are included under Kentucky regulations that are not reflected in their stuff, but they've got really, really good resources. All right, so now we're going to talk about predictors of post-school success and some transition practices. And this, again, is largely coming from the NTAC. So, and they have a lot more information. I'm going to do a brief overview like I did earlier, but they have so much information. So Mazzotti et al. And Valerie Mazzotti is actually part of the NTAC-C. In 2021, so she actually did the original research 15 or 20 years ago. And then last year or 2 years ago, she and a bunch of other folks redid the research. So they conducted a systematic literature review to look at the existing predictors of post-school success and see if there were any new ones that we could find and identify. And so they have 14 predictors that were supported. So from the original set of predictors of post-school success that they identified, they said, oh yeah, 14 of these are still really good. And we found 3 new ones. And then the NTAC-C took that information. They took those predictors. We're going to talk about what they are in just a minute. And then they evaluated each of those predictors based on the original research conducted and any additional research since then, and categorized the predictors based on the amount of research available as either evidence-based predictors, or research-based predictors, or a promising predictor within each of the 3 identified areas of post-secondary transition, so education, employment, and independent living. So this is one of their documents. And so this is looking at all of the predictors, and this is actually several slides because it's really long. And like I said, they have a lot more information and they link all of these in different ways to different resources, including effective practices. But so when we look at this, we see that, for example, the second bullet down is career technical education. In the original research, they called it vocational education, but as we know, language changes and best practices change. And so now we really call it CTE. And so what we see is that CTE is a research-based predictor of success for post-secondary education, and it is an evidence-based predictor of success, post-secondary success for employment. And so what we mean then is that there's a lot of evidence in the body of literature, research literature, to show that students participating in CTE do better in post-secondary employment. They are more likely to be employed post-secondary than peers who are not in CTE. So that's sort of how we look at this. And when you look at the Intact website and some of their documents, they actually can link you to both the resources and how they figure this out, but also resources on how do we help, in this example, helps more students get involved in career technical education. And in Kentucky, this is a lot of what our ARP, so the American Rescue Plan transition team at the KDE level, this is a lot of what they're doing. So they're really working with these predictors and going into different districts with different programs and really focusing on how do we improve results for kids by really focusing on these predictors and helping districts improve their work within these predictors. So here's just more of the predictors. Like I said, it's long. And the biggest thing to note is that right now it's still a relatively limited body of research. And so the only one that is evidence-based is that CTE. It's the only one that currently meets that threshold because it's still a relatively limited body of research. But the other side note here, and then I'm going to talk more about what the ARP team is doing, is that there are a lot of evidence-based practices that we use in other realms of education that are appropriate and make a lot of sense within transition. So we think about like self-determination, and some of the evidence-based practices around teaching self-determination or self-advocacy. Those are a big component of successful post-secondary transition services and implementation. So there's some crossing over, but the only transition specific one that is evidence-based right now is the CTE. Now, so part of this is that the Intact has the PISA, which is the Predictor Implementation School or District Self-Assessment. And this is what the ARP team is doing. They're helping schools and districts use the PISA to evaluate their current programming and then make some changes to improve outcomes for kids. So the PISA provides operational definitions for each of those research-based predictors of post-school success. It also suggests ways for teams to assess the level of implementation. So it really is an assessment, self-assessment. It's all about you going in and looking at your programming and saying, this is what we're doing, and this is maybe how we could improve it, or let's talk through how we could improve it, because I thought we were really working on getting special education students into CTE, but then I look at our data and we're not. So that's all part of the PISA. And then as sort of a side companion to the PISA, we have the Taxonomy for Transition 2.0. And this is also from the Intact. It was done by Kohler, Gothberg, Fowler, and Coy. Catherine Fowler is actually the head of the Intact C. And so this taxonomy provides research-based practices for the implementation of quality transition education. And so it really looks at 5 primary practice areas, and we're going to look at it in just a second. Student-focused planning, family engagement, student development, program structures, and interagency collaboration. And so these 5 primary practice areas are then further divided into actual specific practices under each of those that you can use or focus on in your school or district in order to really look at how are we developing quality transition programming. They have also, and I know this is really small, they've tied the different predictors to each of the areas. So this is what each of the areas includes. So like student-focused planning looks at IEP development, it looks at planning strategies. So how do we incorporate student input into planning, student participation, how do we get students involved in the ARC meetings, or we're looking at like program structures, and that's looking at like our actual characteristics. It's also looking at how are we evaluating our programs, how do we know that what we think we're doing is actually working. thinking about strategic planning, so planning years in advance and planning like how we're going to strategically approach all of these different pieces, looking at our policies and procedures. So each of these 5 areas is broken down further, and then there's a really great document that INTAC-C has, the Predictor Taxonomy Crosswalk, that looks at each of those 5 areas and attaches one of those predictors of post-school success to the area. So like one of the predictors of post-school success, I think it was promising, was like parent expectations. And so parent expectations is aligned with like student focused planning and IEP development, and it's aligned with planning strategies, and it's aligned with family engagement, right? So if we're engaging with our families, then we have a better understanding of the parent expectations, and we can help as educators help parents understand what things are possible, right? Because what parent doesn't want really good things for their kids? But often we get parents, or at least I got parents at the high school level, who didn't even know what the possibilities were. And so that's part of this taxonomy and this idea of working with family engagement and parent expectations is how can we help inform parents? And that's a piece of how do we improve our programming so that we're improving outcomes for kids, because we know parent expectations plays a big role in that. All right, so this was, I know, a super fast overview of several different resources at the INTAC-C, but I want to be mindful of our time. So any questions, comments, wonderings about any of those that I just like sped through? Okay. So the next resource, and I think this will probably take most of our time until we have some discussion, is looking at some Kentucky guidance. So Kentucky, last year, put out the Kentucky Profile of Transition Practices, also known as the KPTP. And I know that Becca sent this out as some sort of pre-reading. If you had an opportunity to look at it, you might have noticed some similarity to some of the documents we've discussed before, because the KPTP is very closely aligned with the taxonomy for transition. If you look at the full taxonomy for transition, it's really big, it's really overwhelming, there's lots of pieces. So the KPTP really took that information, narrowed it down, and made it more Kentucky specific. And so we're really looking at some pieces for Kentucky. So the KPTP, it is a reflective tool. Again, it's designed to support districts in reviewing and assessing post-secondary transition practices and programs. It's not designed to be evaluative. It's not a gotcha. It's really like a self-assessment reflective tool. And the goal is to help schools and districts improve post-secondary transition by supporting the implementation of what we call core post-secondary transition components. And we're going to support district continuous improvement by encouraging reflection on those features that are embedded in the existing post-secondary transition programming practices, and hopefully sparking some conversation about this is what we're doing, where can we go, what barriers are there, and let's really start thinking through how we can address some of those barriers. So the KPTP is broken into, again, those 5 core components, and this is exactly like the taxonomy. That student-focused planning, the program structure, student development, family engagement, and interagency collaboration. And this is where it deviates a little bit from the taxonomy. For each core component, we have foundational features. And so these are those essential elements, and they're operationalizing the core components by describing some sort of associated activity. And then we provide an example of a well-integrated practice. And so these well-integrated practices are what it might look like within a school or district. These well-integrated practices are not requirements. They're not constraints. You don't have to be doing those exact things. They're really just designed to help schools and districts understand what we mean by the foundational features and like spark some thinking about, well, it could look like this, but it certainly doesn't have to. Because as we know, Kentucky's a really big state and everyone's setting looks a little bit different, right? If you're in Louisville versus in, I don't know, Rowan County versus out in Paducah, your needs and your settings are going to look different, and we recognize that. So this is what it actually looks like. So this is looking at core component 3. So this is under student development. And so it defines student development, right? So student development is just that program where we're really looking at identifying students' assets, interests, needs, and then we're directly teaching skills necessary so that they can transition. We might be thinking about self-care, independent living, or financial management. Can the kid count change, or can the kid balance a checkbook? Does anyone balance checkbooks anymore? I don't know. I don't. Or we might look at, can I manage my own health? Can I recognize, do I know how to call a doctor if I need to? Or do I know how to access other resources? Or can I participate in my community? Like those are all pieces of student development. And so a foundational feature, and there's several of them, but one of them under student development is going to be that, so 3.1, assessment and progress monitoring data. So all that stuff that we have to do anyway, they drive instructional decisions, and it's routinely shared among educational staff, service providers, parents, and students. And so one of the things that we're really hoping that districts and schools think through is, are we doing all piece of this? So we know that regulation, so this well-integrated practice, we know regulation requires ARCs to discuss progress monitoring and other assessment data, right? That's just a requirement. But we're also thinking that in this well-integrated practice, that progress monitoring and assessment data is shared in easy to understand language with parents and students and all relevant educators routinely, right? So it sometimes happens that at IEP meetings or ARC team meetings, we have a gen ed teacher, because you have to have a gen ed teacher, but maybe we don't have all of the students gen ed teachers. Well, how are we making sure that all of the students gen ed or CTE teachers are getting that progress monitoring data and understanding what it means? How are we making sure that we're making this make sense for our parents? Because education is very much a acronym, lingo heavy place, and this doesn't always make sense for our parents. And some of our parents are just as anxious to be back in the school building as adults as they were as kids. And so how are we helping them feel comfortable enough to let us know that we're not making sense? Or how are we making sure that we are making sense? These are all pieces of that well-integrated practice. And so, like I said, this has 5 core components, and underneath each of the core components, there's many foundational features. Each of the foundational features has an example or 2 of well-integrated practices. And then there's also guiding questions, and this is a whole separate section. These guiding questions are, again, designed to support that team discussion and analysis. This isn't a gotcha. This is a reflection tool. And so we're thinking through, there's some prompting questions for current practices, like what is happening now? What evidence do we have that it's happening now? Like how many times have I gone into something and we're like, oh yeah, we're absolutely doing this for all students. I'm like, my students are not included in that. So you're not doing it for all students, right? So that's a piece of this, right? So are we doing it? And even if we think we're doing it, what evidence do we have to show that we're doing it? And it's also thinking through, well, is there a problem? So like, is there a barrier? Are we doing this really well? Are we really hitting some of these transition ideas with our students who are in self-contained classrooms because they have time in the day to build in to do that, and we're not hitting it nearly as well with our students who are in gen ed classes all day? Or the opposite, or is there some sort of population that we're missing, or are we really struggling with this particular barrier? We don't have access to the student, or we don't have access to a material we need, or we really need a community member to come in. Like, what are the barriers? Do we not have a lot of employment areas in our region because we live in a really rural spot? You know, those are barriers. And so the current practices are really thinking through some of those things. And then we look at needs and assets. And this is where we start thinking about, well, where should our focus go? What resources do we have? So maybe I don't have a lot of ability to take students on field trips, but we do have some connection with like our community tech, KCTCS, and maybe we can pull in speakers virtually, you know, or whatever our resources are. And where can we start envisioning an opportunity? What gaps do we have? So that then when we get to our next steps, we're thinking about what are measurable short-term goals, what are expected outcomes, and really prompting that thinking, that forward thinking of let's take what we have analyzed already, and where can we go from here? That's the guiding questions. And so that is one template in the appendix. And the guiding questions aren't designed for the entire piece at once. It's designed to use with one core feature, right? So it's really designed for deep dive analysis on one feature, not looking at all of them at the same time. And then Appendix B in that document is an action plan template. And so that's really a template that we use here at the state level often to assist your transition teams to really plan out and then take actionable steps towards reaching those short-term goals. Because as with all of this, our goal is to really support students in improving their post-secondary outcomes. And we do that by improving our practices. And within the KPTP, there's also a section on resources specific to each of the core features. And then I have resources. And so these were all links that were included when Becca sent information out. But so we have the NTAC website that we've talked a lot about. We have the KDE transition web pages, and there are 3 of them. There's transition links for parents, transition links for students, general transition resources, and this is where you'll find way back when I was talking about the regulations, the summary of academic and functional performance sample forms, they're on there. The KPTP is on there. This OSERS, the transition guide, has fantastic information about how we're really working with students on that post-secondary transition and really looking to improve some of our practices and programs throughout. These are just the references for what I talked about with the Mazzotti and then the Kohler, Gothberg, Fowler, and Coyle. If you're interested, these are both on the INTACT website. I'll pause here for a minute if you have any questions for me. I know I went really fast through a lot of that. Okay. Well, then, Becca, my understanding is that we typically break into small groups. And so I had prepared a couple of discussion questions based on that pre-reading, thinking through how you might use that KPTP in your current setting. So a foundational feature that's embedded in your settings practices, or if you have evidence, barriers, and then really thinking through what next steps might be needed. And then also, and I know Mike had talked about this early on, that part of, I think, KOI Leads is sharing this information with others. So what information or resource are you most interested in exploring more and sharing with a colleague?
Perfect. Yes, thank you. That was a lot of great information. Before we go into breakout rooms, if you need a reminder, just take a picture of the question that's the discussion questions that are on the screen right now. And I will put you into, I'll put you into your breakout rooms, and I'll send a 1-minute warning before we bring you back. I'll bring you back about 11:50. So you from each room share a little bit about the conversation that you all had. So if there's someone from room 1, which is Tasha, Krista, Holly, Sarah, and Savannah, would someone like to share?
You said Sarah Pointer. Was that room 1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, there was only 2 of us that showed up in the room. So that's why when you named all the people. But one thing we discussed is just that both of us, it was like every single thing we discussed today was brand new to us because I'm a speech therapist. So even though I have been in ARC meetings and worked with middle and high school kids and seen the special ed teachers talk about transition, I've never had to be the person that did any of the paperwork or any of the so there's a lot of it I don't know. And the other lady that was in the breakout room with me is only preschool. So it was like we that was basically what we talked about a lot of the meeting, is just all the things that we have learned and heard that we didn't know because we both have not had to work on this side of it, you know.
Mhm.
So it was very informative because, again, it was all brand new to both of us.
Thanks for sharing. And if I call some of the some of the people that are in the room, maybe were assigned from last week. So if there's a disconnect, that's why. But thank you for sharing. Room 2, Paige, Melissa, Savannah, Miranda, or Kane. Does that sound?
Well, I was in that group. This is Melissa, and I can talk a little bit about. So we had some interesting takes because of middle school and kind of high school. Most of us were focused in middle school, and so that's kind of our understanding of transition. You know, where we are introducing our students to the ARC and coming to those meetings and having those discussions, and they don't want to come and they don't want to talk, and you know, and things like that. And I shared in our group that I have an interesting perspective because my son, who's getting ready to graduate, was just we just transitioned him from an IEP for the first time to a 504 plan. And so as a parent, I've seen that side of things too. So it's just a different lens you look through. And Kane, if you want to add anything, or Paige, either one, we talked about a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we one of the topics that we got on for a minute was accommodations and services that are provided at the college and university level, and how a lot of students aren't really aware of that and the assistance that they can get with their IEP in a post-secondary education setting, but also the information that they have to provide in order to get those accommodations.
Great, thank you. I just noticed that we only have 5 minutes left in our meeting, and I want to be respectful of your time. So instead of going room by room, I'm just going to open up the next couple minutes so that I get you all out of here at noon for anyone who'd like to share. And if you don't get a chance and you'd like to, I just encourage you to use the discussion board to share out. And just a quick reminder to complete the survey as well, and I'll share that link in the chat. But feel free to raise your hand or just open up your camera and your mic and share instead of just going room for room.
One of the
I'll
things
share. Oh, sorry. I'll mute. Go
Sorry.
ahead.
This is Amanda. So one of the things that we got talking about in our group is Daniel and I both have had experience with our alternative schools and looking at those post-secondary options for our students who unfortunately may be frequent flyers through there, and really trying to look at creative ways, not just within that setting to provide those opportunities for instruction, but also community components to that. And Daniel was sharing some of what they've done in his area that my district is just beginning. So there's some things I'm going to actually take back to our director of safe schools, who I work with for our alternative program, so that we can really look to help start stemming that pipeline to prison issue.
I can go. This is Marty Escalante. So just quickly, in our group, a couple of us had experience doing the yo-yo data collection. And then we also talked about how in our districts that there seems to be, you know, obviously, well, a lot more opportunities for our kids that do not have moderate to severe disabilities, but our children or our students who have moderate to severe disabilities, there are not as many opportunities. We all agreed we struggle to get OVR to attend our meetings and to kind of show up and help us. Another thing we talked about is the parents sometimes have the misconception that if their students go to work, then that will affect their disability check, but that there is a certain number of hours that they can work and still get their disability check. So I think the information presented today was very, very helpful. Our district has been on a cap before for transition, so I haven't been in charge of it, but I've heard a lot about it, and it's something that we're really focused on. So I do appreciate this information today.
Thank you so much. There's been a couple of good comments. Allison, they're thanking you for sharing this content. And then Alan, he mentioned that he posted a question. It's unrelated to today's discussion, but he would love to hear other scholars' idea. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I've provided the link to provide feedback, as well as the link to keep the conversation going and respond to Alan if possible. And I do want to thank Allison for showing up on a Saturday morning to share her knowledge and resources with me. Allison, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you next month. Email me
Thanks,
if you have
everybody.
any questions.